Welcome to the first episode on my new channel, Nerd.World History. Let me start out with, I am not a historian or an archaeologist, but I do have a serious passion for history to the point where I drive my girlfriend insane talking about it, and I need another outlet. So some of my information on this channel will be my own speculations, because my particular period of history that I have such a fascination with is prehistory, particularly British and European prehistory. And of that, it's particularly the Iron Age that I have always had something of a soft spot for, which is why I'm starting out with a video about Boudicca, a fascinating figure from history and one of the most underrated and under-taught characters. Speaking as one that grew up in the British education system, I didn't even learn about her until after I had left school. And this is someone that fought for her nation, her people, and this country in a sense, and we don't even learn her name in school. So I want to shine a spotlight on the periods of history and the individuals of history that sometimes just don't get enough recognition, or they're just not explored extensively enough, probably outside of YouTube, where you can find quite a few videos on them. With that said, I'm going to get started on this video. Hope you enjoy it. Please like, share and subscribe if you do, and check out my other channels, Nerd.World and Nerd.World Films, that are obviously very different to this one and have absolutely nothing to do with history. But check them out anyway, you might like them. Okay, so Boudica, or Boudicca, and there's always been a debate as to which pronunciation is correct, because obviously there's no recordings of her name from that time period, it's all wrote down, translations, blah blah blah. I'm going to stick with Boudicca because that's the one I'm most familiar with, and somehow Boudicca just doesn't roll off my tongue very well. But anyway, she was born to the Iceni tribe, which lived in Norfolk, East Anglia areas of southern England at the time. Now, we don't know exactly when she was born, we don't even know the exact date of her death, but we do know that she was later married to Boudica, the chieftain of the tribe, chieftain being one of the few words I should point out in English, as I understand it, that's a true British word, as in it's not, English is a mongrel language, it comes from all over the place, and chieftain is one of the few that's actually one of ours, apparently. It's not an imported word from French or Latin or a Scandinavian dialect, it's one of the original Celtic, so he would have been called a chieftain, which basically means king. So she was the queen, as we all know, queen of the Iceni. The Iceni tribe formed an alliance with the Romans upon their invasion in 43 AD. Instead of opposing them like a lot of the other tribes did, such as the Catavaloni and others, the Iceni and a few others, particularly from the East Anglia area, such as the Trinovantes, signed a treaty with the Romans, becoming a client state of the Roman Empire. Now, under Emperor Nero, things were a little more shaky. Is an interesting figure from history. Obviously the Roman invasion was still in full swing. The total invasion of England and Wales, or what would be England and Wales at the time, took the Romans something like 40 years to fully accomplish. So by the time of the revolt in roughly 60 AD, we're about halfway through that. So the Iceni have been putting up with Roman rule for about 20 years. Now, Boudica knew what could happen to a person. These people weren't stupid savages like the Romans would have us believe. Bear in mind that history is written by the victor, and the Romans are the ultimate spin doctors of their own success in history. They invented spin, they invented blackening their enemies to justify their own, what we would now consider to be war crimes, and their own invasions. The whole invasion of Britain was a pseudo sort of vague excuse made up when the Atrebates tribe appealed for Roman assistance, as they were an ally, because the Catavaloni tribe were mounting wars against multiple Celtic tribal states in southern England at the time, and the Atrebates were not a war. Unlike reputation, not every Celtic tribe was particularly warlike, and the Atrebates were not a particularly warlike culture and couldn't stand up to them, so they appealed to their allies in Rome. The Romans invaded. We're not really getting into that, but that's the basic backstory of it. It was an excuse. The Atrebates gave the Romans the excuse they were looking for to invade, but they would spin it like they were coming in to help their allies, and they were quelling the savages and bringing civilization. Now, as I said, bear in mind, history is written by the victors, so writers like Tacitus wrote a picture of the, which could be considered quite inflammatory now, the savage queen, a woman rebelling against the might of Rome. They painted her as all kinds of things, which were probably very unflattering. Now, Boudicca knew that the Romans wanted his kingdom. It was an understanding that when he died, the Romans had basically inherited it. Now, he left in his will half of his kingdom to his wife and half of his kingdom to the Emperor Nero, thinking that that would satisfy Nero. He was probably more naive than he thought he was. The Romans obviously didn't accept this, as women couldn't own land or be rulers in their own right. So at this point, the Romans just seized all the territory and told her, tough, it's ours now. At this point, Boudicca, still being a queen and thinking that she demanded respect from the Romans, although they disagreed with that assessment, rode to meet with the governor of Britain and appealed a decision, saying that basically, half this is mine, it's not all yours. Now, the Romans decided to make an example of her and tell her that, we're in charge, you have no authority or power over us. And they, now, as I understand it, there are some people that believe this may not have happened exactly how it is wrote down, how it is recorded as happening. It may have been exaggerated or embellished, but in basic brief, the Romans had Boudicca flogged and her daughters raped by the Roman soldiers. This was obviously a massive insult. Could you imagine something like that happening to the royal family now, which is how the Iceni would have seen it? She returned home and had been degraded and defiled. Her daughters even more so. And hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, right? After this insult, Boudicca and her daughters would return to her tribe of the Iceni, and they would call a meeting with some of the leaders of the other local tribes, such as the Trinovantes. All of them will be equally outraged at the Romans' treatment. Now, bear in mind, you've got to look at a larger context of the situation that's going on. No one, even the allies of the Romans, were particularly happy to have them around. Everyone had been having lands confiscated, fines levied upon them, things like their people taken as slaves, all kinds of stuff, things that they weren't necessarily what they signed up for when they became client states. Some of them never became client states, they were forcibly made client states, they were conquered. No one was happy to have them around. Now, it's wrong to think of all these people, despite having a linguistic and cultural and religious connection, as being one nation. They weren't. The idea of Britain being a single nation was a foreign concept. The Iceni were a nation, the Trinovantes were a nation, the Canti were a nation, the Belgi, they were a nation, but Britain was not. So the Romans had managed to take what were a bunch of disparate tribes that had spent thousands of years. Bear in mind, these cultures were ancient when Rome was young. Before Rome existed, these cultures existed, and they've been at each other's throats for that long, and the Romans managed to simultaneously slap them in the face and insult them and unify them in a way that even their invasion had not managed to do. Everyone was aggrieved by the treatment of one of their queens. Now remember, in Celtic culture, women had more rights than perhaps they did in Roman culture. It's basically, again, a Roman concept that women were inferior to men. There may have been certainly strong elements of this in Celtic culture, but women in Celtic culture often held powerful positions as warriors, landowners and chieftains in their own rights. Another famous female British warrior leader would have been Cartimandua, for example, of the Brigantes tribe. Now, with this insult they all began to band together and they wanted to oust the Romans. Now at this particular time it was bad timing for the Romans. They were busy trying to stomp out all the Druids up on Mona, the Isle of Anglesey as it is now known. So there was a good 10,000 troops up there. Everywhere else was guarded by auxiliaries, leftover troops, basic forces. Boudicca and her warriors, her sort of ragtag army she managed to throw together, began to sack the Roman cities. They started further north. They hit Camulodunum, which is now Colchester, Verulamium, which is St. Albans, and quite famously they burned Londinium, London, to the ground. The temples dedicated to the emperors, with people burnt alive inside them. There is still evidence of it in London today, under some of the streets, under the pubs, of the remains, the foundations of Roman buildings that still have cindered bricks and scorch marks in them from the intense heat of that fire. The Romans panicked at this point. Remember, many of their troops, their finest troops that were in Britain, were off fighting in Wales. They had all the secondary troops sort of scattered around. They started to call in auxiliaries, they started to call in retired troops, anything they could to try and stop this massive Celtic horde from basically wiping them out. It was bad enough that there are some preparations even made that just in case she won, which this was more prudency than really thinking the Romans actually believed that she was going to win, but there was some preparations put in place for the Roman evacuation of Britain just in case. Now obviously the Roman legions would hurry back down the main artery that they had made down the centre of Britain, which was known as Watling Street. Now the mistake Boudicca made here is she'd already fought a few smaller limited battles with Roman soldiers and won. Whether that had gone to her head, the Celts had a bit of bloodlust going on, or whether they really just thought overwhelming numbers were going to beat them. A Roman army of maybe 10,000 was assembled to oppose her at what became known as the Battle of Watling Street. They allowed the Romans to pick the ground. It basically negated their tactics. Celts liked to fight individualistically, whereas Romans fought much more, well, in the more famous Roman way. Shields locked together, their little swords stabbing through. The Celts, on the other hand, had long swords that needed a lot of swinging around. They used spears, they liked their chariots, and the Celts, particularly British Celts, were known for their chariot warfare. The Romans saw this as a backwards sort of nostalgic way of war, but the Celts kept it modern. They had perfected chariot warfare through the millennia, and that form of warfare requires fairly wide open spaces, something the Romans denied them. And if you believe Tacitus and other first-hand accounts, which I do on this occasion, her baggage train, which was all the logistics and spoils of war and stuff they'd taken, were all sort of arched behind them. So her troops had nowhere to retreat to either. They would run into their own women and children, their own baggage train, their own logistics. And the Romans would slaughter them. It was a perfect example of how no tactics versus having tactics can allow you to win a war if you think strategically. The Romans, no arguments, they were one of the best fighting machines in history. And the Celts, as much as they were individually proud and powerful warriors, they were by no means a match for the most advanced war machine in the world. Think in terms of modern conflicts when America invaded the Middle East. It was like a boot stepping on an ant. There wasn't really a contest. And it was the same back then. We were the Middle East. They were the Americans. We were the ant, they were the boot. There are better tactics, and the Celts sort of, shall we say, not learning from experience with Romans led to their defeat. About perhaps as many as 100,000 Celtic warriors and other civilian bystanders, I suppose, were slaughtered by the Roman army that claimed it only took a few hundred casualties. Whether that's true, we're not sure. But certainly it was a very one-sided battle. Now, the aftermath of these events, as much as we don't know much about Boudicca's early history, we do know quite a bit about what happened in the last period of her life. We don't actually know if Boudicca died at the Battle of Watling Street. The Romans claim she did, but no body was ever recovered, at least none that was ever identified as Boudicca, so she either ended up in one of the mass graves, or her body was taken away, or perhaps she survived. But if she did survive, she doesn't turn up again anywhere in the historical record at any point. It can be said the same for her daughters, who were probably at the battle. Now, if she'd have been captured and taken as a slave, that would have been, they'd have done to her what they did to Vercingetorix and dragged him, or in this case her, through the streets of Rome, and likely, I don't know, chucked her to the lions or something the Romans liked to do with their prisoners, as they were such a civilized people after all. Now, the real world consequences for what happened are a little more nasty and are quite typically Roman. They punished the peoples of the Iceni and Trinovantes. They were banned from carrying or owning weapons. This is something the Romans had done before, but now they really enforced it. They basically made them pay for the revolt, basically. They declared it a slave territory and took many of the Iceni and Trinovantes people away as slaves, and they suffered the harsh and oppressive yoke of Roman rule much more iron-fistedly than the rest of Britain would be doing for quite some time. Obviously, over the following decades, that level of grip would loosen, but certainly for the next 10-20 years after Boudicca's revolt, the Iceni did not feel any freedom or peace from the Romans as a punishment for what they and their queen had done. Now, looking back on it, at least from my point of view, not only because I'm British, but also because I'm human, I look back and I see, realistically, a conquering army oppressing, murdering and savaging its way through a local population. And they got exactly what they deserved. Their cities burned, their people slaughtered. There's only so far you can push someone. The Romans had no right to be there. No right to punish Boudicca and her daughters for simply asking for what was theirs. The whole situation could have been handled much better by the Roman governor, shall we say. A more amicable arrangement could have been made that could have saved lives on both sides. But that's history. History is violent and bloody, despite what you might learn. And yeah, as I say, for the real world consequences of this revolt were bad for the Iceni. So was it worth it? I mean, they didn't win. They didn't get their freedom. In fact, things got worse for them. So it's really a matter of perspective. Do you consider it worth it to die fighting against an enemy who murders, rapes and enslaves your people, or would you rather live under them? Would you rather be like them? If you can't beat them, join them. That's the basic philosophy with the Roman Empire, right? It tried to Romanize the world, civilize particularly the Western European nations of Gaul, France and Germania, obviously Germany, and, well, Hispania was already Carthaginian before the Romans, but it's different part of history really, isn't it? Britannia was to the Romans like what the moon was to people decades ago. It was too far, too dangerous to ever go there. It took a lot for the Romans to come in. Once they were here, they weren't leaving just because someone revolted. It was to be expected. As much as we might like to sometimes look back and pat ourselves on the back and say, yeah, she nearly won, she didn't. It was never a close victory. Yes, the Romans prepared to leave just in case, but I'm sure that was just the Romans being prudent. It was nothing else. They were a very, very efficient people who hope for the best, plan for the worst, as the old adage goes. It would have been short-sighted of them not to at least prepare to evacuate. So, again, was it worth it? In a way, yes. I wouldn't personally want to live under an oppressive power that invaded my territory, invaded my people, and tried to wipe out my way of life. Boudicca's revolt can be seen as the last maybe the last hurrah for Celtic culture in southern and eastern Britain. Now, today, there's very little trace of the Celts, their language, their culture, their art. Who and what they were isn't who and what we are today. Celtic culture survives in Britain in the fringes. Scotland, Wales, Cornwall, and obviously the nation of Ireland, as well as on some of the smaller island chains, but a lot of the time it's to the periphery now. And there are many complicated events that took place after the Romans that caused this, but it can't help but feel that something's been lost. There is something to be said that generally in British culture we are a stubborn, defiant people that don't like to be told what to do, and that I think is something we get from our fiery Celtic ancestors. Now in history, if the Romans had had their way, if you believe Tacitus or anything that was wrote down about her, she was just some primitive savage that the Romans had to put down in order to civilize her people. But in history I think she's been remembered somewhat differently, particularly considering the Victorians went through a little PR campaign liking ancient figures like William Wallace and Boudicca, erecting statues to her in London, etc. I think she's taken on a different status, a symbol now of defiance, and that even in defeat you can still have some measure of victory. Both Roman and Celtic culture in one form or another survive on until the modern age. Boudicca herself and her specific people might not have done, but the Romans did stop, effectively, ultimately, at Hadrian's Wall, and the people of Scotland, the people of Ireland, they were never overly touched by the Romans, at least not completely. So in history she's remembered as a great warrior, a great figure from our history. But with all the confusion of her origins and her true status, I mean, we don't know that Boudicca really fought in these campaigns, was she really a warrior? I mean, she was a queen. She's historically a warrior queen, but these are all labels attributed to her in more recent times, in the last few centuries, such as in the Victorian era. But whether or not she truly was a warrior queen, or was just an inspirational leader, or just a symbol, how much control she had over her army is debatable. How much she was really in charge of it is debatable. It could have been somebody else, one of the other Celtic war leaders. We don't really know. We might never know. It's all lost to history now. But she does stand as a symbol of British defiance and, to a lot of women around the world, a feminine icon. She endured something horrible, and she came back and gave them a bloody nose, and she made them pay for it. She made them at least understand that that's not the way you do things. We won't just take it lying down. In that regard, she was victorious. And many now actually regard her as one of the greatest historical figures in British history. So, I don't know what everyone else thinks of Boudicca, and I really love her from history. I think she's one of the more fascinating characters. The events of her life, the tragedy that took her to rebel against Rome, because bear in mind, before those events, her and her husband were wearing their togas and get along just fine with Paulinus and all the other little Roman cronies that had turned up. But the events of her life took her to revolution, revolt and war. Doesn't matter that she didn't win. Not in my opinion. She's a fascinating figure from history, and let's face it, from that time period there aren't exactly many women that are recognized for much, particularly by the Romans, who didn't recognize women as being very much. She stands out as not only a great revolutionary and inspiration to her people, but also as a feminist icon and as a military icon. And for a woman in that time period, that's impressive. Very impressive. Well, that's it for this video. It's been going on for quite a while now. let me know what you think about Boudica in the comments below. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, fantastic. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe, and hopefully I'll be doing more of these videos, and I'm hopefully going to make them not quite as rambly and refine them a little bit more as I'm going. As I did right now, I mostly just want a channel where I can vent and talk about history and the people and things from history that I find interesting. And hopefully someone out there finds it interesting as well. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.